So we're going to be talking about consciousness, and some of this might feel a little bit philosophical, um, but some of it will also feel a little bit more in the realm of like empiricism and cognition. But there is this question of, well, what is consciousness? What does it mean to have consciousness, to be conscious? And so I have a question for all of you. How can somebody tell me how you would define consciousness, like in your own words? How would you tell somebody what consciousness is?
I would probably say like being aware of something, like I'm aware, yeah, alert or aware or something along
Mm-hmm.
those lines.
Great, awesome. So being alert, being aware. Does anyone have any other features, characteristics that they might add to that?
Like explicit knowledge.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, right? Knowledge that we can have access to in the moment, for sure. Anyone else?
I think it would be like the access of a choice versus like an
Mm-hmm.
automatic thing is not really a choice, but conscious processing is having access to choose to do one thing or the other.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. You're all really nailing some of like the key elements of consciousness. And so consciousness as a concept, it is really hard to sort of come up with a nice, neat, short dictionary description of consciousness. But what you all are getting at is that there are these various features that we can say are involved in consciousness. So there's a really great neuroscientist, Steven Pinker, who has written a lot about this concept of consciousness. And so some of the factors and features that he proposes are involved in consciousness, just sort of broadly, is the idea of self-knowledge. And so some of you were saying like this conscious awareness and this access to knowledge. And specifically, our consciousness is often the knowledge that we have about ourselves. And like I said, being able to have voluntary access to information. And then there's also this idea of sentience. So this idea of having this subjective awareness that we are conscious. So this idea of it's kind of like this meta experience of, oh, I'm aware that I'm aware, right? I know that I am conscious and aware, and I'm sitting in a lecture listening to this lecture. And so there are also some other characteristics that we want to talk about too that the book points out. And so these include the metaphor of sort of this multi-layered iceberg, so to speak, of consciousness. We also have this sort of paradox of there being time limits to our consciousness, while at the same time there's this continuity, this sort of thread of consciousness that runs throughout our entire life. And then also this idea that there isn't like this necessary consciousness center in the brain, but rather that the brain regions that are responsible for our experience of consciousness. So not only like waking up and being aware in the morning, right? Of like, oh, okay, I am no longer unconscious, right? I'm no longer sleeping, but I am conscious and aware and in the world, but also our subjective sense of that consciousness as well. And so we're going to talk about this iceberg metaphor first. And so as he's going to come up in almost every psych class you ever have, including in grad school. So Freud had this idea of, and again, he used this metaphor of human consciousness being an iceberg that has several different layers to it. And so the layer that is sticking up out of the water, that is our consciousness. And so this consists of the material that we are aware of, that we know that we possess, and that we can also voluntarily sort of call to mind, so to speak. And so just below the surface of the water in this metaphor is the subconscious or the preconscious. These words are often used interchangeably, but they're the same thing. And so this involves information that we could become aware of. So in the present moment, we might not be aware of a certain memory or a sensory sort of experience, maybe. But this is the kind of information that can pop into conscious awareness, that can pop up to our conscious thinking in kind of this like aha moment of like, oh yeah, I remember that. And so in that present moment, before you called it to consciousness, it was just sort of there hovering just a little bit below. And that's why you were able to just pull it out so quickly, is because it was within reach, so to speak, of that consciousness. And then finally, we have the unconscious, which as its name just exactly suggests, this is information that we don't have conscious access to. We aren't able to voluntarily pull this information up. And so we've seen these delineations demonstrated in some of the concepts that we've talked about pertaining to memory. So such as example of implicit memory, or Tolkien's even distinctions between the sense of knowing and the sense of remembering. We can kind of think about those as sort of mapping onto or being explained by sort of this metaphor of this consciousness iceberg. And it is important to note that the distinctions between these levels of consciousness, they are permeable. So it's not that you can only be on one level. You can flow in between them. So even though there are these sort of proposed boundaries, we know that things that are in our unconscious can then enter up into subconscious and then our conscious, and like vice versa. And so we also want to keep in mind that these are processes that also interact with one another. So it's not just like, oh, the conscious part of your mind is just sort of doing its own thing, but rather there's this interaction between these different sort of layers, quote unquote, of our consciousness. And so the phenomenon of blind sight is something that actually really nicely and interestingly demonstrates this sort of permeability or the fluidity between these sort of proposed levels of consciousness, and also shows us sort of this interaction between them as well. And so blind sight, it refers to this phenomenon that people who have had damage to their visual cortex experience. And it's really interesting. So those who have blind sight, they're able to respond to visual information that is in the blinded part of their visual field. But it's this awareness that happens actually outside of consciousness. So in these cases, patients will deny that they can do a task, and it's true in their experience. They're like, I can't see that. I'm missing part of this visual field. I'm not able to see that. But their performance shows that they actually are able to do these things. So for example, there's a study in which people with blind sight were shown a spot of light. Light was flashed at a location that was a little bit to the right of the center of their visual field. And for these patients, this area was where they consciously were not able to see. They were not able to see information from that part. And then they were asked, okay, well, can you point to the light? And so typically these people with blind sight were like, what light? I don't even know what you're talking about. But when they were encouraged to guess, that is draw on more unconscious sort of information, they actually were significantly better than chance at identifying where the light was flashed at. And so on this slide, I have an example. This is somebody who has a deficit in the left part of their visual field, but a similar sort of idea is shown here. So you can see that these numbers, they represent the percent correct when the person had to make a choice. So this was when it was like, okay, you have to make a choice. You can't just be like, oh, I don't know. And so you can see that they were pointing things out with a high degree of accuracy in this area where they can't see, they can't consciously process information, but they were still really able to take these guesses, so to speak, that actually were informed by unconscious information that they had. So what is going on here? How does this happen? So the idea is that although most of the information from the retina goes to the visual cortex in the back of our head in the occipital lobe, some of that information also is spread out to and sent to other locations in the brain. And so it's this information that is thought to allow people with blind sight to guess and to be able to report things like the location of a stimulus, the color, the shape, maybe the like angle of motion that it made when it flashed across their visual field. And so this suggests that visual information that passes through the visual cortex, the primary visual cortex, is registered in consciousness. So that information that goes straight to the back of the brain, that is what is consciously entered into our awareness. But the information that doesn't go to the primary visual cortex in the back of the brain, but rather spreads to other areas in the brain for processing, this information doesn't get registered into awareness. And so it is therefore thought to be processed at the level of the unconscious. And that this is why participants are then able to, if they have to guess, right, if they kind of have to go with their gut, so to speak, that they're often able to do this. They're not consciously able to tell you, oh yeah, I saw a blue ball, you threw it over here, but their unconscious experience still gives them information about what they've seen, even though they say that they didn't see it. And so another aspect of consciousness that we want to talk about is the sense of continuity that our consciousness gives us from moment to moment, day to day, year to year. And so this is the concept of having a stream of consciousness, this ongoing phenomenon that builds upon itself over time as we age. And so you have this constant sense of self. And even though you can think back to being 5 and you're no longer 5 years old, you still know that you are the same person. You've grown and changed in a lot of ways, but there's still this sense of continued you, so to speak. And so we've seen what happens when there are interruptions to this sort of default mode of consciousness that, you know, just all humans inherently have. And if you remember, Clive Waring is the man who he had gotten a viral brain infection, and he had suffered both retrograde and anterograde amnesia from this. And so because of this, about every 30 seconds or so, he would report that he felt like he was waking up from a nap. He was coming out of this sense of nothingness into the present. And so unlike Clive, the majority of us have a sense of continuity between what happened the day before and then what is happening in the present every morning when we wake up. So another feature of consciousness that we want to talk about that we've already discussed in the past, but we're going to elaborate on a little bit more here, is that our minds are capable of doing really an immense amount of processing in a very short amount of time. And we know that this is the result of these really efficient mental shortcuts that our minds use to try to save energy and to really bolster the processing capacity that we have. And even information that is more complex can be processed in these more efficient ways in the form of really unconscious processing. And so in a study of patients who had sustained damage to their right, excuse me, oh gosh, sustained damage to their right hemisphere, which then resulted in left-sided visual neglect. So because they don't perceive the left side of their visual field, they forget that it's there. They forget that there is a whole world and scene happening to the left because they don't see it, they don't perceive it. And so in the study, they quickly presented pictures to the right visual field. And so this was something like really simple, like a fruit or an animal. So they presented it to the side of the visual field that was still intact. And then they did the same thing to the left side. And so in some of these picture conditions, the pictures were not associated with each other at all. It could be like banana and chair. And then in another condition, the pictures that they were shown were associated. There were connections to them in some way. So like table and chair, for example. And so all of these blind sight patients, they openly denied that they saw anything in the left side of their visual field. However, the participants were faster to respond that they didn't see anything when two pictures were related. And so in short, there's this higher level processing of information that was going on outside of people's conscious awareness. And I just have this picture on the slide just to remind us of what this visual field neglect really looks like. So again, they're really not attending to or perceiving a good portion of the world around them. And so our consciousness is not only selective for certain information, but our access to it can also be selectively granted as well. And so there has been some debate surrounding the degree to which we're able to attend to the contents of our consciousness. And there are some researchers by the name of Nisbet and Wilson, and their argument was that we're not very good at accessing our mental processes. That is that people often say, well, I know what I'm doing as I'm solving this complex problem, but they actually don't. And they say that we have good access to the product of our cognitive processing. So we have conscious access to the decisions that we make, but we don't have access to the actual underlying processes themselves that got us to those decisions or those responses. And so because of this, we tend to just fill in the blanks, right? Our minds, they like to make meaning of things. They like to try to fill in the blanks and the gaps. And so because of this, we often come up with a good story, not in a malicious sort of way, but really just sort of trying to make sense of, how did I actually get to that decision? And so an example of a situation like this could be one where somebody's trying to decide that they're going to buy a bike and they're looking at 3 different models. And the person, when they go to check out and they buy the bike, they can tell you, well, if you ask them, well, why did you choose this bike? Well, they could tell you, oh, it had the, right amount of gears that I wanted and the price point, and I like the color and things like that. But really, we know that there's so much more going on sort of underneath that, unconsciously, that they aren't able to actually fully speak to. And a well-known example of the limits of our conscious knowledge and the limits of sort of our access to knowledge is the idea of subliminal perception. You might have heard about this as being referred to as subliminal messaging, used in like a consumer advertising sort of setting. And so this idea of subliminal perception, it refers to perception that is so subtle, so barely there that it doesn't reach our conscious awareness. So if we think back to our iceberg metaphor, the subliminal perception is really just in the shallow water, just beneath the surface of the iceberg. And a lot of the research that has been done on subliminal perception has been done on our visual subliminal perception. And so to do this, typically people will flash something on the screen really fast. Like we're talking in the matter of 10 to 15 milliseconds. So incredibly fast enough that you consciously do not register it. And so because of this, the visual information is processed unconsciously. And they then can have some brief and subtle effects on our feeling and thinking. However, the effects of subliminal perception, they are generally small, and often are brief as well. And so there's been a lot of talk about subliminal perception and messaging in ads and marketing. So for example, there's this really sort of popular story about in 1957, a researcher claimed that he had increased the sale of soda and popcorn by subliminally flashing drink Coke and eat popcorn during the frames of movies. But this turned out to be a myth. And so there tends to be this idea regarding subliminal perception that it's really strong and deeply effective. But research shows us that, well, the effects tend to be minor and usually short-lived. But it still gives us evidence of the things that we do and do not have conscious access to in our daily lives and the things that we experience. And generally, we're aware of the products of our processing. So we're aware of the end results, but we're not aware of the steps that it took to get there. And so, for example, we just finished talking about scripts and schemas and the idea that when we are recalling something, we activate a schema. So, and this is a useful mental shortcut because it helps us to fill in the gaps, right? It's efficient. But as you know, as we've talked about, the possibility for errors also exists, particularly if something happened or appeared that was not typical, right? It did not conform to our script. Suddenly, that efficiency is kind of stopped in its tracks. And so the point that we're going to focus on as we continue talking about consciousness is that although we are aware of our memory, right, we are actually aware of the product of our memory. So again, we're aware of the end result, but we aren't very knowledgeable or aware of how we got to that point. And so because of this, our memory errors are very often undetectable. It can be really hard for us to catch errors because we don't catch them in the moment. I kind of think of it as like doing a math problem right? So if you look at just the answer, you can say, oh yeah, that's right or wrong. But sometimes if you look back at how somebody showed their work, all of a sudden you realize, oh, well, you made a misstep there and you actually forgot to, do this operation, but okay, interesting. Somehow you still ended up with the right answer. And so we see this possibility for errors when we are perceiving things, when we're trying to reason through something, when we're making decisions. And so this is this goes back to, if you'll remember, Jacoby et al.'s false fame study, where people misattributed their knowledge for names and the associated fame. People were saying, oh yeah, that name, that's a famous person. At the end of the study, when they were trying to recognize names that they had seen on a list before, and rated those people as, oh yeah, that person's pretty famous. When really it wasn't that the person was famous, it was that the participant knew that name because it had been on the list of names that they studied previously. And so again, we're not able to kind of catch the sources of our errors or the reasons why, but we are aware of the responses that we've come up with. And so there's this really interesting study by Nisbet and Schachter that is related to this. And so it was back in the 60s. So it was, well, I think in 66, yeah, that probably still was before the time where we had really stringent IRBs. But anyway, this study involved the application of electric shocks to participants. And they experienced a series of shocks that became more and more intense. And the question was, well, how bad of a shock would someone withstand until they were like, okay, I give up, I'm out, that's too much. And so what they did to examine this is that half of the participants were given a placebo pill beforehand. So a pill actually didn't do anything, but they told participants, hey, if you take this pill, it's gonna lower how much pain you experience from these shocks, but just know that there are some side effects that come along with it. You might get shaky hands, you might get butterflies in your stomach, you might start breathing fast, but don't worry, just side effects of the pill. And then the other half of participants, they didn't get anything at all. And so what they found was that the participants who had been given the placebo, they continued on receiving the shock 4 times longer than the other participants. And so looking at these results in the context of unconscious reasoning and decision making, it's possible that the participants who didn't have the pill saw maybe some of their physiological symptoms, how their body was responding to the shocks, like, oh, my hands are shaky, oh gosh, I'm sweating, I think I'm freaking out, I think I gotta stop, I don't feel good, I think these shocks are too much, I'm gonna quit. However, those who had the placebo, which again, keep in mind, didn't actually do anything. It was just like a sugar pill. It didn't have any active ingredients in it. The reasoning here, at least the researchers reasoned that why those with the placebo kept going is that they saw their symptoms and they just attributed it to the pill. So they observed their symptoms, but they just discounted them as side effects of the pill that they were given. And the reason that this is unconscious reasoning, or a demonstration of unconscious reasoning, is because when participants were asked, why did you, like, wow, like you really hung on to that and got a lot more electric shocks than other people, like what was going on? Like, why did you take that on? They never mentioned the pills or the physical symptoms that they were having. They were even asked specifically, well, while you were receiving these shocks, did you think about the effect of the pill at all? And they responded with things like, oh no, I was too worried about the shock to think of anything else. That wasn't factoring into my decision making. And so the experiences of these symptoms, people's proposed reasons for why is my hand shaking, was essentially a very unconscious process, and people weren't able to speak to why they had made the decision that they did. They rather just attributed it to, well, I was really focused on the shock. So there's all of this other information that went into their decision, presumably, that they weren't drawing on to explain. And so, like these participants, we also sometimes think that the processes that we think about have been conscious. We all like to think, oh yes, I'm so rational, I would never do anything on an impulse, right? I would think things through. And if someone asks us, well, why did you do that? And you hadn't made a conscious decision to perform that, you might find yourself trying to go back, retracing your steps sort of mentally and trying to figure out why. And interestingly enough, people are really confident about why they behave the way they did, right? If you press somebody, why did you do that? They usually can give you a response, even if at first they're like, I don't know. If you keep pushing them, they oftentimes can give you some sort of reason, maybe why they made that decision or why they didn't. And so, again, we like to think that we're very reasonable and logical, and most people will report, well, that they carefully considered their actions, the various causes, the various maybe influences in the environment. But research has actually shown us that when people give us these reports for why they did something, they're often not accurate. And so the idea is that we do this because when we try to give a response as to why we did something, we don't have access to our unconscious. So we then often try to look to another source to inform us. And that's general knowledge about how and why we might act in that situation. So essentially, we don't have access to the unconscious. And the unconscious and its processes are a lot of what factored into that. And so we tend to make what are plausible inferences. We tend to make these sort of what we see is like, well, this is a pretty well-informed guess, right? Well, I guess I made that decision because of X, Y, and Z. And it's really troubling for us to hear this. Most people, they don't like to hear this. We like to believe that, oh yeah, I think especially in Western culture, where it's this idea of you are an individual, you kind of have control of your own destiny, those sort of things. We don't like to be told that we actually don't know ourselves very well. And so I'm going to go back to the debate regarding our ability to access our mental processes. So we had covered Nisbet and Wilson's idea about the fact of people don't have very good access, right? We think we do, but we don't. Erickson and Simon, they took the opposite stance, and they said that, well, actually, we do have good access to our complex mental processes. And they use a technique called protocol analysis. You don't need to know exactly what that is, but they used it to try to understand how people solve problems in chess or in cryptography, which is like code breaking. You're given like a secret code and you're trying to figure out what it means. And so essentially, what their participants did is that they would talk out what they were doing, what they were thinking about as they were playing chess or as they were trying to solve the crypto code. And they found that, well, when people were vocalizing their problem solving process, their decisions were based on pretty clear and well articulated sort of inner dialogue and reasoning. So, well, first I would try this. Let me go ahead and try this. Maybe they're trying to break the code, right? They're like, well, maybe the one here corresponds to C. And they try it and they're like, well, okay, that's not the case. So I know that C can't go there. Let me try another letter. And so they are able to talk through their reasoning. We are logical to some extent, and we are aware of the processes that we need to take to make decisions. And so essentially all of this discussion goes to the fact that there is this interaction and also this permeability between our levels of consciousness. And going back to the chapter on attention, we know that there's automaticity that is involved in some of our cognitive processing. And then there's also a little bit more control that's involved. And we also see that within sort of this larger sense of consciousness as well. And so a question that comes up as we're talking about our conscious and unconscious is this idea of control, because we see that there is some control that we have, right, with our conscious processing, where we can voluntarily control what we are aware of, what we're focusing on. And so this brings up a question of, well, what makes this kind of control possible in our consciousness? How are we able to turn our conscious awareness towards things like our thoughts and ideas and perceptions and things like that? And so, to answer this question, we need to assume that there's some sort of executive, some sort of, going back to the CEO metaphor, right, that's overseeing how we will launch certain actions, or how we will override certain actions of like, no, we shouldn't act on that. So there are these various abilities that we think make up our qualities of consciousness. So we've been talking about these various qualities of consciousness. And researchers have been trying to relate these qualities of, such as being continuous, time limited, this sort of idea of varying levels, etc., to various structures and functions in the brain. And so the long and the short of it is that there are a lot of different brain areas that are responsible for consciousness. So there's no sort of consciousness area or set of neurons or anything like that. And so rather, there are kind of two aspects of consciousness that we have then mapped to certain brain regions as brain regions or structures as being pretty critical to those aspects of consciousness. So the first aspect is this alertness or the sensitivity to our environment. And so this is this result, or this aspect of consciousness is something that can become compromised when someone suffers damage to certain parts of the thalamus or a certain part in the brainstem called the reticular activating system. And so typically when people sustain damage in these areas, this is when we see people who are in comas, right? So their consciousness, their alertness, they are not able to sustain the brain activity that's needed in those areas to sort of be at a baseline level of being alert and awake. And then we also see that the second category of consciousness in terms of brain structures and their involvement, it really pertains a lot to sort of our visual consciousness, our visual awareness. And of course, this involves the visual cortex, which we've been talking about. It also involves our frontal lobe as well, which again makes sense, because if we're talking about having control over our awareness, we know that a lot of our attentional processes are involved with structures and pathways in the frontal lobe. So this does bring up the question of, well, what is it about the brain that makes consciousness possible at all? What is it about this physical material of the brain and neurons and synapses and things like that that lead to us having this sense of consciousness? And so this is really big. That's like the $9 billion question in cognitive neuroscience and like philosophy. There's a lot of people nerding out about a lot of different ways to respond to the idea of how do we become conscious and aware based on brain matter. So all that to say, there's a lot. But one of the more popular hypotheses or reasons is this idea of what's called a global workspace hypothesis. And so here, the central idea for this theory is that the content that is within our consciousness, so the things that we're aware of, are fair game for a variety of our other cognitive processes. So it's like this idea of like a shared workroom, right? Everyone can go and use the printer. Everyone can go and use the refrigerator. Everyone can go and use the sink, etc., and things like that. And so our consciousness then, this sort of shared workspace of our consciousness is then what allows the integration and processing of other things. So this is why we're able to pay attention to things. And this is why we're able to make decisions, is because we have this sort of common area that is our consciousness. So it seems like so much of our experiences begin as like these various sort of distinct separated out elements. So like going back to when we were talking about sensation and perception, at first we have these bits and pieces that are coming into our brain about the thing that we're seeing, and we're trying to put it together in its entirety. We're trying to see the gestalt of it all. So if I'm just looking at a computer and I just see, well, there's some keys and I guess there's a charger over here. I'm not integrating fully all of those aspects into a singular concept. And so this global workspace idea has been proposed to sort of help us better understand how we might integrate and put together the various features of information and material that we consciously encounter. And so like this is called like the binding problem in the textbook. And so this is the task of, like I said, putting together the different aspects of experience in order for us to have this sort of coherent whole. And we've talked about so for example, we've talked about sort of the underlying processes that are involved in sensation and perception of, okay, you know, the retina is taking in the information, sending it back to the primary visual cortex, etc. And so it is believed that there are these certain kinds of workspace neurons. And this is more conceptual. This isn't like at the neuroscience level where people have put a slice of brain under a microscope. What's a magnoscope? I think that would just be a telescope. Anyway, I'm inventing new things. Yeah, so it's not like we can take a slice of someone's brain and put it under a microscope and be like, aha, the workspace neuron, there it is. Just sort of more of a conceptual idea of a certain role that particular neurons might play. And so it's thought that these workspace neurons are what are really helping glue together our elements of consciousness. They're what is helping us assemble or bind these various features that we've perceived into a larger whole that we can then recognize as, oh, okay, that's a computer. Oh, okay, that's an apple. Rather than being like, well, I see round and red and there's like a certain smell to it. So again, these workspace neurons, they're not involved in the content of our consciousness. So they're not firing information that helps us come to a particular outcome or a decision, but they help put together the elements that make our conscious awareness. And so going back to the idea that we talked about a little bit ago, that there's this need for control over certain aspects of our consciousness, how does this workspace exactly do this? And just overall broadly, the idea is that the workspace neurons are able to function because of our working memory. So we're able to hold and manipulate things, and in this case, put things together, bind things with these workspace neurons because of our working memory ability. And so lastly, now we are going to focus on the idea of a qualia of consciousness. And this is maybe a little bit more philosophical, but essentially qualia is a fun, probably Latin word for your subjective experience of your consciousness. So what it means to feel like you and be awake and interact with the world. And so let's take an example of this. So imagine meeting someone who has never tasted chocolate before, for example. And so if you wanted to try to help this person understand what chocolate tastes like, you could give them like a really vivid, detailed description of what it tastes like. You know, it's sweet and it kind of has this like smoothness to it. Maybe if you're eating like the really like good chocolate, like Ghirardelli or something, there's maybe sort of this like melty, buttery quality to it. You could compare it to other flavors. You could, if you wanted to, you could really nerd out and talk about what happens when the molecules hit your tongue and then are processed by the brain and etc. Right? There are a lot of different ways that you could go about describing the taste of chocolate to someone. But what you're not able to do is to give this person your unique, subjective, first-person experience of just what chocolate tastes like to you. So there's this sort of idea, right, of, oh yeah, we all know what chocolate tastes like. But your experience of chocolate is likely different than mine. And so this really goes to show sort of this idea of this really unique, individualized experience of our consciousness. And I knew that putting up this picture of chocolate was going to make me want chocolate. So sorry to those of you who I have also induced into wanting to have some chocolate. Also, I'm very much a really big Harry Potter nerd, and so when I was thinking of this chocolate example, I immediately thought of Prisoner of Azkaban when Remus Lupin gives Harry some chocolate to help him feel better after the Dementors. Okay, moving on. So a question then that comes out of our subjective experience of consciousness, this qualia, is about how involved that is with our mental processes. Is this qualia, this subjective experience, really critical to our day-to-day mental processing, or is it just, you know, some sort of side process that's involved or that's happening, but maybe not really as involved in our day-to-day? And the answer is we don't really know, but there are some hints that we can take from what we know about consciousness so far. So if we look at our behavior, so specifically our spontaneous and our intentional behavior as an example, it could be that this qualia of consciousness, this subjectiveness, has a role in behavior in some way. So maybe it influences our behavior in some way. And so if we go back to our example of people with blind sight, we can think about the fact, well, why don't they just spontaneously use the visual information to guide their actions, right? It's there. They are technically able to access it, so why don't they? Why would they only use that information when the experimenter tells them, okay, you have to give me an answer. You can't just say, I don't know. And we can also ask the same kinds of questions about those who have amnesia, like Clive Waring, who insist they don't know how to do something. And also, interestingly enough, we also see similar kind of behavior in people who do not have brain damage. And I think that these, or at least this study that we're going to talk about, it does speak to this subjective experience that we do have of our consciousness and the things that we are aware that we're aware of, essentially. So in a study by Graf et al. In 1982, they recruited college students, and they were asked to learn word pairs, classic, and then they were asked to recall them in one of two ways. So they either had to recall them directly by way of being given a cue. So they were given like a word stem with like the first three letters as a hint, or they were asked more indirectly. So then they were asked, tell me the first word that comes to mind that starts with CLE, for example. And the results of the study showed that the students who were asked directly to recall, that is, they were given the clue, they actually did worse than those who were indirectly asked, essentially those who were told to guess by being prompted with, well, tell me the first word that comes to mind. And so the question is, well, why didn't these students who, or these participants who were given these direct cues, why weren't they more accurate? And also, why weren't they engaging in guessing in the way that we saw with the participants who were just prompted to come up with the first word that came to mind that started with those letters, right? I mean, presumably it should be same sort of recall process happening, right? And so one possible answer to this, and by this, I mean the question of why we don't use our implicit knowledge, is the fact that, well, in a lot of situations, we are taking action based on the information that we're aware of. And so when we do this, it seems like we have to not just have access to the information. So essentially, when we're recalling information, it's not enough to just say, oh, it's there in memory. Great, I will pull that out. Here you go, researcher, here's the answer. But rather, in some instances, we know that the information that we have access to is really vague or poorly remembered, or we feel really unsure about it. So if you're like taking a test and you're like, man, like my gut says it's C, but like, I don't know, maybe it's A. Like I'm really trying to rack my brain and think about, you know, what I remember that might help me decide. You have this sense of not being sure. And so often what we need in order to believe that our information is credible or more accurate is this conscious feeling of having the right information. There's this qualia or this gut feeling that is associated with our conscious and unconscious processing. So here in this experimental condition with these college students, conscious experience was people actually felt less sure of when it came to their conscious processing versus when it came to their unconscious processing. And so this speaks to this idea of our, what's kind of called our intuition, right? Which is also another name for our unconscious. And also speaks to having the sense of a gut feeling, this sort of subjective sense of, I feel like the answer is C. I feel like it's not A. I feel like it's C. And so, but again, these are things that we don't have conscious access to, and therefore we don't have very good explanations for why we went with that. We just are like, well, I don't know. That's just what came to mind, quote unquote. So that is our discussion of consciousness and unconsciousness for today. We will pick up and continue with this lecture on Friday. Does anyone have any questions though before we break for the day?